All right, welcome to the May 23rd Dev Call, everyone. We have a few items on the agenda today, so just to go over them really quickly. Dan's going to talk about decentralized channels, which just went live a little while ago. Horsefax and Tony are going to talk about programmable DCs. We're going to talk about the longcast idea that we're exploring at a very high level. And then Sanjay and Cassie will talk about two issues with hubs. One is some changes we've been making to pruning, and two is issues we've been running into with fnames and an updated state on how those things are working. We also have some updates at the end on the Warpcast side around direct messaging. We'll try to get through all of this today. I know the channel's discussion might have a lot of stuff, so if we don't, we will just post updates on Farcaster about the rest of the topics, and we'll try to go through them in priority order. So with that, let me turn it over to Dan and Chris, who've been working on the new version of channels, to just give an update on where we are today and what to expect over the next few days.
Okay, so channels phase 1 of the decentralization plan is live. So we've removed a bunch of Warpcast experiment features like channel passes, hide, warn, ban, things that we know aren't going to scale well in terms of decentralization. And then there's also just a couple of things where we've explicitly wanted to allow developers the kind of freedom to build new alternatives. So channel passes was pretty prescriptive within Warpcast. Now anyone can go build an economic model or any type of gating model. Similarly, the mod software. So obviously AutoMod has existed. That was on the Warpcast APIs. Now there's a kind of marketplace. So I think Airstack's launching something today, and then there are a few other developers launching tools because now all the kind of feeds are pretty explicit in terms of, if you like a cast and moderation is on, that's what goes in the feed. We are going to let this bake for about a week. So kind of want to see all of the edge cases. I already have an ongoing list. Work on some of the kind of like UX improvements for users. And then once we have a good feel that this model is working, we will start working on a draft technical spec for how we plan to add all of the kind of remaining pieces of channels that are Warpcast centric to the protocol. So just at a high level, there's a bunch of metadata and settings around channels, obviously moderation being probably the most important one relative to the others. And then channel followers obviously are currently centralized. So I think those are the two big buckets. I will defer to the team as they think through what data structures make the most sense to live on-chain versus hubs. We will have the technical spec and people will be able to, put input in. But I think that the other thing is, it's always important to remember is like the folks who are working day to day on hubs, like know kind of like, okay, this is actually going to generate a lot of messages, which could potentially be upstream of potential sync issues later. So I think we'll let the team kind of drive that and then have it out for people to put input on. A couple of other things. We are not changing channel names right now. We will probably almost certainly do a cleanup prior to kind of going on chain. There's a bunch of channels that are squatted right now. And, one of the perks of having done this with Warps is we can easily refund people in the sense that nothing was done on chain and there's actually really no economic cost in terms of being able to do that. So I think the goal is to be able to do that as part of the move into the protocol. I don't think we've made a decision in terms of how names should work. There's a decent chance that we actually approach it like the fnames, where we say, hey, this is going to be a managed namespace for some period of time. And in a world where you have something equivalent to an FID, call it like a channel ID, you do own your community and your audience, but maybe not the handle. It's worked completely fine for fnames. I don't think we've ever had an issue with an fname. We did have that one issue a couple months back with some of the channel stuff. And so I think just thinking thoughtfully through that and just being pragmatic, that's how we've done everything. And we can kind of set a roadmap towards what is actually owning a channel name. But I think what's critically important is the follow graph of a channel and the ability to control that feed is actually infinitely more important than the name. People get emotionally attached to names, but I think just like FIDs, that's actually the core of the network. All that said, we haven't made any decisions there, and we are very focused on let's get the product UX this next week feeling really good, and then shift over to drafting the technical spec and then putting it out for feedback like we usually do. So probably start in Notion, get people's feedback probably at this meeting as well. And then we will work towards like kind of making a formal FIP and then kind of move towards getting stuff into the protocol. Assuming there is an on-chain component, this is going to take time. There will be audits. So I think optimistically 2 months would be great. Like we want to push as fast as possible, but at the same time, I think it's like reasonable to think this is probably something that lands maybe right around the beginning of September. So we are going to try to keep things simple, and I think we've tried to simplify it. So I'm optimistic that we can actually move forward pretty quickly, but the stuff we want to do it right because once it's in the protocol, it's much harder to change. Okay, questions on channels. I was accused on Farcaster of not doing good comms related to channels, but I guess this group has been paying attention to my communications.
Really? No questions for Dan?
Varun goes to me before the meeting. I think people are going to have a lot of questions about channels. Woj, this goes back to what I said. I think if I made a mistake at the original product explanations, I tried to just outline what I thought might go on chain versus hubs. I will let the much more I don't even know how I want to say it. My very smart colleagues who think about this stuff day to day, they will make a recommendation that people can have input on in terms of hubs versus on-chain. One thing I will say is if there's a channel fee, which we anticipate there being, we will not do that on hubs because we do think blockchains are actually a useful technology for moving around economic value.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think let us come back with like a clear-cut proposal of like, hey, this is what it's going to look like after we've had some time to think through and bake it, rather than give you an off-the-cuff answer that is going to end up changing over time. One of the reasons for that is I think this week is going to be a very important week where we figure out the things that we don't know about this new version of channels and we fix them. And then there might be more or less things that need to go on chain as a result of that. And so once we have the confidence that we have all the pieces together, we can come back with a plan and say, this is what we're thinking of doing. But yeah, high level, moving money on the blockchain as much as possible off chain to keep things simple, and then some combination thereof to like put things on hubs versus on chain and make that work.
Yeah, I would say the one other thing is from a product standpoint, it's a little tricky because in the past we've always been able to be like, oh, we're running into this problem. Let's just add this feature, which is relatively easy to do when you have a centralized implementation. But every additional thing that we have to fix, we have to actually do in a way that is like reasonably decentralizable and actually scales. So hide-worn ban, useful crutch when it's centralized, not so much when it is decentralized.
There's a question on, will the Warpcast channels APIs have breaking changes and will they eventually be deprecated?
I would imagine we will have a very clear plan in terms of once the spec is kind of finalized to say, here's how we plan to do it. I think there's probably some in-between state where Warpcast continues to maintain those public APIs for some amount of time, but is very clear on when things click over.
Yeah. I would say you should expect that when channels go on chain, there will be a set of breaking changes because some things you can do through the API will now need a transaction on chain. And so that's fundamentally very different. But I don't expect any breaking changes in the next 2 months. Cool. We'll do one last.
Guys, sorry. Generally speaking, will there be anything like sign in with a channel or something? Like I know the current plan is to have the feed as an owner of the channel, but will there be anything else in this direction?
I'm not sure I understand, but maybe if I can play back what I heard. The idea is today we have sign in with Farcaster, which you can sign in using a user, which is an FID. Sign in with a channel. Would you'd be signing in as the channel, or you sign into a channel? I'm curious what you're asking.
Sorry, no, as a channel.
Okay, so I have memes. I want to sign in as memes to one of the tools. So the way to think about it is every channel is owned by an FID. So you just sign in with that FID. None?
When we go decentralized, is likes still going to be what we use to kind of like allow list casts into a feed, or because that might conflict with like the like storage, the reaction storage, and like moderators will have to continue like buying more storage to be able to operate across the several different channels. And
Yeah, so let's kind of go two pieces there. One, should we add another reaction? I know there are a lot of people here who've read the protocol spec be like, great, this is the first chance to add a new reaction. I think there's a potential that we do that, and that I will defer to the team that thinks about this stuff in terms of like, does that make sense to do? That anytime you add something new, that adds more complexity for clients that are starting up, right? Likes are really simple. Like if you look at my original goals, keep it as simple as possible. But let's say you had some like curation action or like promote or whatever. That very well could be the best solution, but I want to let the team actually have the freedom to kind of like dig into it and think about that. There's also some kind of like components of like, for example, the idea of like being able to rank. So like, well, I want this post to be first right now versus second or third. Like, so there's a bunch of ideas around like, how do you kind of further curate a feed if you have moderation mode on? So something that we'll kind of take a first pass on and want people's input. Obviously, we're open to input now, but I want to give the team some space to think about that. I think the second thing is, there's a lot of people who have kind of gone back and forth on like how much on a storage unit, how much like storage versus cast storage versus whatever. I think Varun has it to do at some point this year is to just kind of reevaluate that and potentially kind of look at that from first principles. But I think when we did the initial analysis and when we since looked at it, I don't think it's like too far off from what we thought. And if you have to also think about this from a perspective of the network, is the average user, their casts probably matter much more to them than their likes, right? And so that is actually probably the first way to define it. If your channel has so much good top level content that you are liking that many posts to get in the feed, first of all, that's like an amazing like first world problem. That's like, I have so much interesting stuff, I'm burning through my likes. I would imagine there are going to be two kind of options for this. So one, it's $3 to add another whatever number of likes. That's like not that expensive in the scheme of things, assuming that those 2,500 likes are really generating high quality content. Because we are creating economic flexibility for channel hosts, there will be ways people will figure that out. Maybe there will be a promoted post, right? So the ability to like add something in there, they get paid the advertising, more than enough to cover the cost of some increased storage for their bot. And I think another thing to think about is, and I would leave this to either John or Jason to maybe jump in, but you can think of like these channel mod software bots as kind of shared hosting, old school style, where everyone is using the same account and then the likes are actually being added as moderator. But if you're running a big channel, you probably want a dedicated, VPS or box. And so the idea is there's probably going to be like a dedicated account for a big channel. If you're Johnny with memes, like maybe you create memes bot and you pay, 10 storage units, which is $30 a year, which is not that expensive, right? Like you're talking, less than $3 a month for 25,000 promoted posts. And here's the other thing. I know there are a bunch of people on this call who really care about preserving historical data. We've consistently said Farcaster is not a long-term archival medium. You can pay for storage and have that happen. The reality of real-time public square type social networks is the only thing that matters is like the last couple of days of the feed. And so you can kind of think of this as like the likelihood that someone is scrolling back through the entire feed of a channel is just so low. Like we have the data empirically from people using, Warpcast, that there will be people who want to go pay for every single like that they've ever done to promote into the feed, and other people will be fine with it just pruning out, right? And they'll just say, hey, we're going to keep 2,500 for this channel bot, 2,500 for this channel, and that's it. And there will be archival services and Searchcaster and other things like that.
Yep. There are a few questions then, just zooming in from the top. So there's one question about mirroring the ID registry to base other chains, not channel related, but the quick answer to this is we haven't done this so far because there hasn't been anything interesting that someone wanted to build. But if there is something interesting that you want to build, let us know what it is. I think it would actually be trivial for someone like outside of the Warpcast team to just set up a mirror contract where all you're doing is watching all the FID assignments and just mirroring them on chain. And that gives you a crude proxy for executing these checks. That could be like a very simple version of this. And if that gains a lot of usage, I think we would be open to running an official version of this that actually mirrors the stuff over.
Yeah, one thing on a product standpoint, this is a classic like, oh, it would be more composable if we have the FID contract on base. The reality is most people's valuable wallet is not actually the FID wallet. That's like by design. It's actually the wallet they already have, which they already have on all these chains. And so I think like there may be use cases where you have like deeper level of composability that you can figure this out. But I actually think so much of what works about Farcaster is you just kind of say, hey, I am this person, and I am actually represented by a bunch of different wallets. And you can imagine a world where Solana is like a bigger part of the network in terms of people doing activity. Then that composability doesn't even matter, because ultimately what you care about is the individual and what their wallet address on any given chain, right?
Yep. There's another question on, is there a protocol level trace of someone joining a channel? I think the way Dan and I have been thinking about it is we will use follows with a different subtype. So links with a different subtype to indicate that someone is following a channel. Details TBD in the spec, but roughly it's something that will live on hubs.
Sorry, there were a lot of questions. AirStack is paying for storage. Yes. So this is a great example. Like you can use AirStack for channel moderation. They're willing to cover the cost of the likes. That gets unsustainable. I would imagine Jason will come up with some solution around like you get some amount of likes free and then you pay for the premium. I mean, this is like a pretty well understood pattern within like SaaS, right? But I think like for now, people are maybe over optimizing on like, oh, will this scale? Like the reality is like there's not that much interesting content for most channels. If we run into that problem, that is an extremely good problem to have.
Yeah. Two more questions, one from Stefan in chat, one from Sinaver. Let me do the Stefan one first. What does the future of FIP2 look like with decentralized channels? TBD, I think the most likely outcome is we'll let FIP2 live on in its current form. It's honestly not seeing a lot of usage outside of channels, either in other clients or within Workcast. And so there's no plans to change or modify it at this time. There's also no plans to remove it because it's not really having a large tax on storage or anything else at this point. So it's likely that will just exist in its current form. And maybe a year or two down the line, we have a stronger POV on whether to extend it or remove it entirely.
Yeah, so I actually have had a couple people ping me about this. I would very much encourage people to experiment with FIP2. And just so you understand how Warpcast, and we can maybe do a better job, but not maybe, we can do a better job of explaining how we treat FIP2 links, especially in a world where channels are no longer FIP2. It's going to be kind of a new thing. We do not put in FIP2 because it's a reply to something, right? It's a reply to a URL or a reply to an NFT. We do not put that in people's feeds in the home feed. But if you go to a user profile and you click on casts and replies, the second tab, you will actually see the FIP2 replies, and it'll say something to external content. In a world where people have novel use cases and actually are investing in it and like kind of making a big bet on that, we already support it out of the box today on that second tab. It's actually relatively straightforward for us to potentially incorporate it into a feed if we have a better idea of what you're trying to do. But I want to be clear, no promises that we're going to go change that tomorrow. And so there's a little bit of like, if you're willing to kind of like build in that area and we can see something working, it's already in the protocol. We already support it with Warpcast. I think we'd be open to kind of figuring out like what's the right way to increase distribution for those replies to those FIP2 targets in feeds, because obviously that's really beneficial to the growth of an application. But what I would say is like, it's there, you can play around with it. And then very much please share it with Varun and myself. Like I want to know what people are doing.
One more question from Sinaver.
One generic question. I understand that the moderation is out of scope of the Farcaster, right? Because there will be like auto mode and the AirStack and other teams. But do you guys think there is a need for some registry where let's say, for which channels, what kind of gating or NFTs or subscriptions are required?
The challenge with that approach is, where does that logic live? Does that logic live on a hub? That's probably not well suited for that. And then if it's on a smart contract, that means every time you want to actually add some new type of gating, like the speed of innovation that happens in crypto is far faster than our ability to go and constantly be tweaking the contracts. And the version of the world where you offload that complexity to something like AirStack or Automod is you can support n number of chains. And if some new chain comes along, Monad, Blast, whatever the like cool new chain that people are doing stuff on, we don't have to actually go make any change to the protocol. It's just that software's ability to go add that. And so you could also even have like cross chains. So the idea is like, okay, I want a special channel for, call it polychain, like people who are actually using Solana and using Ethereum. And so you look at their wallets on both chains and then you allow them into the channel. And so that level of complexity, and it can grow pretty fast, I think is much better suited to off the protocol, and then just have it be distilled in terms of just like what gets liked actually reflects in the protocol.
Makes sense.
That said, I think that there's probably something that we add. I originally had this in the spec and we cut it from the simplicity standpoint, where for a channel, maybe it's one of the settings where there's kind of like a learn more or requirements URI or URL that maybe has a JSON format that as a client you can hit and then be able to provide a user with the set of requirements to participate in a channel. Or, which I think this is composable with everything in Farcaster today, you could use a frame, right? So it's like, here's the gating frame. Can I post in this channel? Click, it checks your FID, and then, you know, it says like, yes, no, okay, great. We have a text field for rules. So rules of norms were changed to rules. Like we got rid of like host, which we were trying to say everyone finds mods to be negative. It's like too confusing. We have mods, owner, and rules, like very clear terms that like you understand what they mean. No more like kind of like twee cutesy terms.
Cool. One last call for any questions before we move on to the next topic. Going once, going twice. Okay. Next up, programmable DCs. So really quickly, we launched V1 of programmable DCs last week or a while ago now, and they've been out. People have been building on them. So two asks here. One is if you've been building on the V1 APIs and you have feedback, bugs, anything, feel free to share them with us. Second ask is we're starting to think about what V2 is, and I'll let Horsefax and Tony speak to what they're thinking. But if you have any POV on what features or new extensions would be very helpful for you, we'd love to hear those as well, either on this call or async. With that, let me turn over to Horsefax and Tony to give a quick update on how they're thinking about this.
Yeah, I think V2 feels pretty open in terms of what we want to tackle. There's been kind of a wide range of things that people have asked for. Like the obvious one is like read access to DCs, but there hasn't been that many people that have asked for it or like super strong use cases for it. Other things could be around like moderating group management. I know like a lot of the big subscriber groups could use this. But I would just encourage everyone here, if you're using it, kind of be vocal about what you would want to be able to do that you can, and try to make a good use case for like how you're going to use it, and we'll kind of think about what to do next there.
There's a question on what's the best way to provide feedback. We have a group for all the folks who've been implementing programmable DCs. So if you're in that group, just post there. If it's a long item, you could post a doc. If you want to chat live with us and you have a lot of questions, you can also ask to chat with us. If you're not in that group, you can DC me. My DCs are actually open now, so I get requests from everybody. So you can DC me and ask to be added to that group, and I'll fix that later today.
Yeah, Sina mentioned read-only frames and DCs. That's on our list as well. I'm starting to take a look at that today. So it's probably going to start as really simple, like just rendering existing frame embeds in DCs. But I think there's a lot of interesting things we can do there too, with kind of programmability and frames. So if you're sending programmable DCs, soon you'll be able to potentially return a frame and do interactive stuff using frames and DCs.
Cool. Any more questions on DCs before we move to thinking about talking about long casts? Okay, long cast, we're trying something new with this, where this is a very, very high level idea that we have, and we're soliciting feedback from the community if people have ideas on how to implement it. There have been a lot of people who've expressed interest in wanting to write FIPs, and I think this is a good opportunity for people to try and do that. The thinking about this is like there's structurally two ways we can approach this. One is long cast can be something that's actually natively in the protocol. This comes with its own set of challenges where you now have like greater storage costs for casts, greater storage costs for hubs, and everyone in this group running a hub knows that it's now getting harder and harder and more expensive to run a hub. So balancing the like challenges of like how do you prevent somebody from like sticking a lot of messages adding complexity with new message types, etc., with the simplicity of if it's on a hub, everybody has the data, they store it in their databases, and they can easily access it. The second path is on the trail of thinking about like storing it off hubs and off chain. So the idea here being like, hey, you can have a regular old cast, and you can have an embed, and that embed is actually a pointer to a URL that actually stores a very simple version of the post that can be easily rendered in any client. So in the same way that frames work, in the same way that NFT embeds work, these things are all pointers to another location that has the text that can be rendered. This is obviously more complexity for client devs and a bunch of other folks working on this stuff. Where we are in this process, I mean, I think the Longcast idea has been kicked around for a long time. Dan and I have been talking about this for a while. The discourse on Twitter, I think, has actually increased where more and more people are using long form text, and that's been clicking up over time. And we want to explore ideas, but we don't yet have high conviction on like which path we want to take. So if people are interested in exploring and writing FIPs, now's a great time to share that.
Yeah, and just to I know it's a little bit of a joke. Like, yes, Vitalik said it recently, but I think like it's a kind of thing where you can add it. It's very difficult to take away. There's a stated versus revealed preference here in terms of like, actually, if you talk to most people, they don't like reading long casts in a feed. And so I think that just like figuring out the right product experience is always how we start with something. From an actual implementation, as Varun mentioned, it's like, we can go at it. It's like, it's not that work. It's actually the right sequencing, getting the right product experience, knowing that if we add it to the protocol, it's really difficult to take away.
Yeah. And just to share some feedback on like how we think about like these things, like we have tried to add Longcast to the protocol like 3 or 4 times where we've sat down, like pen and paper to design, and then walked away saying, hey, this isn't the right thing at the right time. This doesn't feel like the right priority. So it's less of a, we've said no to people until now. It's more of a, the priority relative to the amount of work has not felt like the right set of trade-offs when the network was smaller. But we revisit all of these ideas that people share like every 6 months and come back and say, is now the right time. And this is another revisit. And there's a chance that we walk away and say, hey, this actually doesn't make sense. The amount of complexity for client devs and for everyone else is too high to justify it. Let's actually come back and do this later. Okay, let me go through some of the comments that people have shared here. Questions on like specific implementation would be a separate data unit compared to current Castwork. I think that's exactly what we are exploring and what we're open to FIPs on, which is I think there are very different ways you can do this with different trade-offs. So just to recap, you can have it just be, you can just extend the regular cast type to store more data. You can add a new cast type so everyone gets like 5 long casts or something. You can have an off-chain storage where data is stored offline. All of those I think are viable options. Cool. Going down the list, auto break. Yep, I know Vripen has a like lightweight discussion out. I haven't actually had a chance to review it, so I'll take a look at it after this call. In the embed case, do we have a hash to embed integrity? That's a good idea. You could have a hash in the cast itself as a secondary embed, or you could have it like down so you could actually verify it, or you could actually say, hey, we just trust the domain and just load the message context as a second item. I think they're both viable.
Yeah, but then there's another argument that like one of the perks of like writing something long on a blog is you have a typo in it, like you can go fix it really easily. So I think you know, all this is like comes from a product experience standpoint, and the thing I'd push people on is like, it works great for people who want to write a lot of stuff, right? That's literally their problem. But the reality is like, what matters is, do people actually click on it, and do people actually want to see that in their feed? And when you ask people something that they're going to say something very different versus like, you give them a feed of 10 casts, are they actually engaging and spending time on the long cast?
Cool. Any questions on this before we move on? Going once, going twice. Okay. Sanjay, if you're here, do you want to give the quick update on the pruning changes that you've been working on? Cool. I'll take over and give the quick update. So we're working on one of the changes to pruning is so everyone has a limit on how many messages they can store based on how much storage they have. When you cross that limit, the way it works today is at the end of every hour, every 2 hours, hubs will actually like process it, check everyone's limits, and if you have messages over that limit, we'll evict your oldest messages. So every 2 hours, there's this like cycle where a bunch of messages get removed. This has actually been annoying for people ingesting data from hubs because things are very quiet, and then every 2 hours you have this huge spike of messages, and then things are very quiet again. And we've actually refactored the design so that messages are actually evicted as they come in. So if you have a limit of 1,000 messages, the 1,001th message comes in, then the oldest message goes out immediately. So this happens more on an ongoing basis, which is just going to make it much easier for anyone using Shuttle or reading messages from hubs to get a more steady stream of messages. The changes merged into the latest version, or it's still in review, I think, but it's going to be merged in soon to the latest version of Hubble. We'll release it over time. No breaking API changes, no structural things, so it should be a minor release, but it will change the characteristics of how data flows out of the Hubble instances. I'll pause there and see if there's any questions on that. Cool. And I just remembered Sanjay is out today and tomorrow, and he will be back early next week. So if you have any questions, he'll be around to take them. He's been the main person driving this PR. Can we improve Hub to detect when multiple events of cast add, cast remove are submitted? If you want to DC me on like the specifics of what you would like to see in the API, we can try to make something work either at the shuttle layer or at the Hub API layer. Cool. Last one is FNAME issues. Cassie, I think you're on the call if you want to give a quick update on the investigations you've been doing there.
Yeah. So there, over time, we've been addressing a few of the issues around FNAME broadcasts. And the latest iteration just comes down to a simple matter of the sequencing of events when a user is transferring their FID. So whether it's recovery or whether they're transferring because they've actually created a new custody wallet or they've sold their FID to somebody or whatever, we've found like a minor race condition around that and have a fix that's going to be landing today to resolve the issues around those particular FNAMEs, which makes up the bulk of the remaining cases where you don't see the FNAME for that user, and despite there being the username proof, you just see like on Warpcast, for example, you just see like bang followed by the FID.
Manan had a question.
Yeah, I just had a question about the solution that is being applied here. Is this on Warpcast backend? Like, will other backends that implement FID transfers also have to implement the same, like, oh, this is how we prevent a race condition? Or is there a way that we can push this fix it at the Hubble layer such that the FNAME registry gets checked at the time of an FID transfer event and such?
This is definitely a Warpcast related bug on the last bit. The larger topic at hand, I believe Sanjay already had some things that were addressing that. It was actually out last week, so I don't know the full context on that part, but the most recent report of FNAME issues definitely related to a bug on the Warpcast side, and it just related to the fact that we didn't wait for the transaction to complete before we had tried to store the delegate signer internally to then later re-sign the user data add message. So there was a little oddities around the sequencing of events there, so that the message would actually go out using the wrong key, like the previous signer key for that FID.
Got it. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. This one was more just like a simple race condition bug on the Warpcast backend. I think we've had FNAME issues before that were more structural to do with how hubs were processing on-chain events and other things, and we have some like ideas for how to rework that. We just haven't gotten around to implementing that yet. For the Warpcast side, I think Cassie has a good handle on a fix, and once this is done, it should be something that doesn't happen again. Cool. Any other questions on this FNAME issue before we move on to the last update for today?
Can I ask a question about the protocol layer in general?
Sure.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, are there any plans to explore adding more flexible constructs to the protocol layer? So for example, the linked message type allows for arbitrary strings. I was wondering if there's other ideas like maybe additional metadata to cast, or the notion of tagging, or even custom fields.
So the long answer is it depends. And the reason or the short answer is it depends. And the slightly longer answer is the trade-off you have to balance there is flexibility lets people do more things at the protocol level, which is always cool. It does mean that now every client has to implement this. And if clients choose not to implement this, then the additional flexibility is not actually useful. And secondarily, additional types or additional flexibility means that the size of data increases. And again, everyone running a hub in this channel is running into the issue where we now have hundreds of gigabytes of data, and it's getting increasingly harder and more expensive to run hubs. And we have to be thoughtful about what we add into the protocol. So the way we approach this is one, okay, here's an idea for a new primitive we can add. Two, who are the clients that are actually are excited about adopting this today? Are Warpcast, Supercast, Nook all going to do this and actually use this in a meaningful way? And three, how much data is it going to add to the hubs over time? And do we feel comfortable about that? And if we find a good balance between all those three, we get excited about adding something. But generally speaking, we are very conservative in that if there's not a clear use case and there's not a clear bound or plan for how much storage will increase by, we're reluctant to add that. But if someone were to come forward with a clear plan that says, hey, we understand exactly how much storage this will generate and why this is safe, and here's the argument for that. And two, here are the clients that are actually going to implement this and use this, so it's actually worth implementing and shipping this today. Very open to doing that. Very similar approach to how Ethereum does a lot of their research, which is like, if you want to ship a new opcode or a new EIP, you have to come with an understanding of how does this impact all the nodes and what's the cost going to be, and then work backwards into, okay, let's ship this and make this work.
Got it. Thank you.
Let me see if there's any newer questions. Cool. Sweet. Last update on direct messages. So the team's been working on direct message improvements in Warpcast this week. So specifically, there's two areas that we're focused on. One is better conversation management. So this is the improving, being able to delete conversations, being able to mark on red, being able to pin conversations. These are all things that are on the roadmap that we're actively working on. The second chunk is better group messages. So there's a lot of cases on web and on mobile where the path to inviting someone is not as simple as it could be. And so we're going to make a lot of improvements that make it a lot easier so that when you want to add someone to a group or want to give people in your group the ability to invite others, that's going to be very straightforward on both web and mobile, which are just going to make group chats a lot easier. And we're going to get all this over the finish line before we go back and think about the next stage of programmable VCs. Cool. Let me see if there's any new questions. On the topic of Warpcast UX, are there plans to improve new user discoverability? Lots of new users are churning because they get no engagement.
I'm happy to answer this because priority mode.
I'll take that down.
So I would love examples. So feel free to either publicly put them or send me them. I think one push I would say is I typically don't actually see a lot of people who already have existing audiences on Twitter come and churn as a result of not getting visibility. What I do see are some people who come in and basically assume that whatever they post should be seen by everybody else. And the reality is like it deterministically understanding whether something's interesting versus not is hard. So I had a list of things, it's on our to-do list, but I had a list of things that people can do. And I think like one thing is like, if you know someone who's joining the network and you want to boost them, welcoming them, doing quote casts of their stuff, like that's going to increase visibility naturally for those people. But any version of the world where we say, oh, well, new users, we're going to allow them to just like show up in people's feeds. If those new users are uninteresting users or bots or whatever term you want to use, I think people tend to use bots for basically people who are foreign language people outside the US who are actually using a phone, by the way. They're not like programmatically doing it and are just not English speakers. So I think it's really difficult to deterministically know, oh, this is a good new user, so let's show it. That said, we do have some ideas that we're going to be working on, but I'm very open to specific suggestions or specific examples of where people are failing with like high quality content, good first effort. And I actually don't believe like if you do 2 casts and then you bounce, like you were really determined on winning. Like showing up on Twitter, you basically have to grind for a really long time to get an audience as well. And so I think like I don't think this is a unique problem to Warpcast or Farcaster. I do think like priority mode makes it harder for a new account. Yes, for sure. But I think that there's tried and true methods for anyone wanting to boot up a new account. So I'm very open to specific examples.
Yep. The only thing I'll add to what Dan said is we actually track very carefully the 30-day retention and how often people stick around on the product. And at least at an aggregate level, that number hasn't changed materially over the last few months. So in aggregate, that hasn't happened. There are obviously cases that are going to be there of individuals who are trying to build an audience and we're having a tougher time doing it. And again, if you have specific examples, please DC us and let us know, and it will help inform how we want to think about this. But this is not a trivial problem, because if we do the naive thing, as Dan said, of just saying every new user gets boosted, you are going to see a ton of spam in your account, because this is a decentralized network. Everyone is free to sign up, and there are a lot of people signing up and posting like lower quality messages on the network, and you will get that in your feeds. And so the problem of figuring out, is someone actually saying something interesting and they should get boosted into other people's feeds, is a really, really hard machine learning problem that we're thinking about and working on, but there are no easy wins or easy shortcuts there.
So one area, and this is one of the reasons we said this at FarCon and are big believers in what channels enable, is in a world where you are joining Farcaster as a result of someone you know or a community you're already in kind of congregating around a channel. Channels are going to be ways for basically people to kind of like bootstrap their following because they can show up to an existing group, right? It's like showing up to the party and seeing your group of friends over there. By interacting in that and in knowing that as a good channel, that makes it much easier for us to be able to push that content out more broadly. But I think until we've kind of solved all of those pieces, jumping into a like basically a public feed social network, like I don't think any network outside of TikTok, which I've actually spent a lot of time recently talking to people who've worked at TikTok and kind of like how TikTok works. And it's a somewhat unique modality in terms of content, because you can show someone a video and if they stop watching it, you just kind of flip. Whereas actually seeing a spammy cast makes people feel kind of like gross. And so I think that is a slightly different kind of way to solve. But overall, no other network has been really that good on it, with the exception of any network that does contact import, which people in crypto don't like doing contact import, that tends to do really well, because then you can immediately find your friends, and friends are the primary reason you stick around on a social network.
Cool. I think that brings us to the end. I know there are a few more questions that we didn't get a chance to address here, so we can take them offline. You can tag us on Farcaster and we're happy to respond, and we can handle, or we can take them in the next call. So we will wrap here. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I can stay.